Hello everyone, welcome to Brookline Booksmith for this very special event featuring Casey Sherman and Dr. Ann Wolbert Burgess. Here to talk about Casey's new book, Helltown, The Untold Story of a Serial Killer on Cape Cod. My name is Adam, I'm a bookseller here at Brookline Booksmith. I just want to first thank everybody for coming out and not only supporting these amazing authors, but also an independent bookstore. We've been in Coolidge Corner for about 60 years as of last year, and that's really because of the love and the patronage of people like yourselves. So really from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for coming out. Please, just a couple of nuts and bolts, please keep your phones on silent throughout the event. Thank you so much for that. I will do the same. If you pre-ordered a copy of Casey's books, you can pick it up over at the desk over there. You can also buy a copy if you want, or 2 or 3, whatever you want. There will also be a Q&A at the end of the event, so definitely have some questions ready. But first, I want to thank Dr. Wolbert Burgess for being with us tonight to moderate tonight's event. Dr. Burgess is a leading forensic and psychiatric nurse who worked with the FBI for over 2 decades. She's currently a professor at the Boston College Connell School of Nursing. So thank you so much for joining us again. And of course, the star of our show tonight, Casey Sherman is a renowned investigative journalist and, New York Times, USA Today, and Wall Street Journal best-selling author of 15 books, including The Finest Hours, Patriots Day, Hunting Whitey, James Patterson's The Last Days of John Lennon, Search for the Strangler, and Animal, The Bloody Rise and Fall of the Mob's Most Feared Assassin. Sherman is a contributing writer for Time, Esquire, Washington Post, The Daily Beast, and Boston Magazine, and he's a recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Award for Journalistic Excellence, and has appeared as a guest analyst on more than 100 television news programs. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further delay, please a round of applause for our guest this evening, Casey Sherman.
Thank you.
And Dr. Ann Wolbert Burgess.
Everybody. So, Ann, how do we want to start here?
I'll start with you.
All right. I'll tell you a little bit about Helltown. That was a great introduction. Thank you again. And as was mentioned, a few of the previous titles that I've worked on. This is my 15th book, Helltown, and I was very leery about returning to this type of subject matter. I do a lot of true crime writing. I've written about gangsters, organized crime, terrorists, you name it. But the first book I ever wrote was Search for the Strangler. Now, that's a book about the Boston Strangler case. Now, for me, that was a very personal crusade because my aunt, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, was the youngest and last victim in that notorious 1960s murder spree. She was murdered January 4th, 1964, in her apartment at 44A Charles Street in Beacon Hill. The book I wrote, which was my first book, Search for the Strangler, was more of a memoir of an Irish Catholic family trying to get justice on its own terms when nobody was really kind of listening to us, because my mother certainly had questions about the guilt or innocence of Albert DeSalvo, the alleged Boston Strangler. And that story really took me down some kind of dark roads. I didn't really want to revisit them. Now, I grew up on Cape Cod where Helltown takes place. And I knew of the story as a kid, but it was more of a folktale and folklore all across Cape Cod. Anytime we went out for Halloween as little ones, Tony Costa, the serial killer here, was in the woods. They called him Tony Chop Chop. He was a mythical figure at that point, and talked about it in a kind of a joking fashion. So I didn't really pay too much attention to his crimes until it was the height of the pandemic, and I just wanted to get the heck out of the house. So I picked up my brother in Hyannis, and we drove across the Cape all the way to Provincetown, and we're driving down Commercial Street, and all the stores are shuttered. And we begin to talk about the ghosts, real and imagined, in Provincetown, and ultimately we land on the Tony Costa case. And we were driving past a lot of the landmarks that you're going to read about in this book that are still there today. So when I get back to my office, my writing lab, I took a deep dive just to see if it was worth exploring, and I was shocked. Absolutely stunned at how vicious these crimes were. And I've covered 50 homicides in my career. I've never seen anything this bad before. I also reinvestigated Jack the Ripper years ago in London, so I would say that this case is about as bad as that. To me, he's the most vicious serial killer in American history. And 53 years later, You know, I had the opportunity not to just write about his crimes, but write about the women that lost their lives, because I always want to pay tribute to the victims in these cases. They're not just statistics. My aunt wasn't a statistic. Neither were the women that were, lured into the woods of North Truro, and their only crime was compassion and kindness toward a stranger or somebody that they knew, which was ultimately the killer in this case.
I just add to that in terms of the beginning work down at the FBI Academy, the kinds of cases that would be sent in were exactly the kinds of cases that you talk about in your book, the mutilation, because they usually make the local law enforcement, they don't know what to do with a case like that. They're so horrifying. So I kind of got, in fact, one of the first articles that we wrote with the agents was on murder and mutilation. It happened a lot. So I really, I could relate to a lot of the cases.
I'm sure you could, Ann.
Not to, certainly to the victims
Right.
and what happened to them.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about murder and mutilation. So what Tony Costa, the serial killer in this case, did, we know that he murdered at least 5 women. I believe he probably killed more, because you don't just, you're growing up and leading up to that. You're evolving as a serial killer. Now, I did a deep dive on Tony Costa's background. What made him, so attractive to his victims? Well, he was very intelligent. He was smart. He was charming. He, brought down their defenses. He didn't look like Charles Manson. He was pretty clean cut, even though he was a hippie. And there were a lot of comparisons between Charles Manson and what he and his family did in LA and what Tony Costa did, because like Manson had his family, Tony Costa also had his disciples, young men and women who were willing to commit crimes and intimidate police and witnesses on his behalf. Tony Costa was an amateur taxidermist who had, a love-hate relationship with his mother. Does that sound familiar to anybody here? Or are we all thinking Norman Bates from Psycho? Because that's exactly what this guy was. And as Ann mentioned, not only did Tony Costa shoot and stab these women, and I'll name them: Susan Perry, Sidney Monson, Marianne Wysocki, Pat Walsh, Christine Gallant. I don't want anybody to ever forget those names. The book is dedicated to them. So these women were, as I said, murdered and then dismembered and dissected and buried in shallow graves. The first victim went missing in 1968, Sidney Monson. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book, Ann, was really elevate the genre of true crime. I didn't want to write a procedural about what had happened and leave it at that. I looked at the texture in the environment in which these murders occurred. And 1969 is the landscape in which I paint for this book. And there are a lot of similarities to where we are today, 2022. In 1969, the Summer of Love is a distant memory. Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, they've been assassinated. We've got a never-ending war in Vietnam, bloody protests at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We also have the inauguration of Richard Nixon. We have the moon landing. We have an incident that is now known as Chappaquiddick, where Senator Ted Kennedy drove off a bridge in Martha's Vineyard and killed a young woman inside. And ultimately, we have the Manson murders. Now, the characters in Helltown have connections to all of these major events. And I was interested, not, as I said, not just, recreating these murders as they happened, but showing these murders evolve through the viewpoints of 2 writers, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. and Norman Mailer. Now, some of you may know their work. Some of you are probably hearing their names for the first time. I knew their work going into the case, and I was surprised at how quickly and darkly obsessed they became with the case and their rivalry to write about the case. And Kurt Vonnegut in 1969 is not the Kurt Vonnegut that we remember today. When you meet him in Helltown, he is a failed writer. He's been writing for 20 years on Cape Cod. All of his science fiction novels don't sell. He's out of print. He is managing a failed car dealership, a Saab dealership on Route 6A in Barnstable. But he's got a story in his head. And it's a story about his experience as a prisoner of war during World War II. Vonnegut was a POW in Dresden, Germany, when the Allies firebombed the city, leaving 30,000 people dead. Vonnegut survived, and his job was to clean up the bodies. And he had images and visions in his head about seeing these charred bodies of men, women, and children, seeing the animals that had escaped from the Dresden Zoo feasting on the bodies of these bombing victims in the streets. Carnage to a point where, thank you, almost unimaginable. He doesn't realize that he is going to face carnage when he comes home in his own backyard. Now, Norman Mailer is at the opposite end of the spectrum as a writer in '69. He's been a perennial best-selling author since he wrote The Naked and the Dead in the 1940s, but he is a larger-than-life figure. You know, he considered himself the heir apparent to Ernest Hemingway, whose birthday is today, by the way. When we meet Norman Mailer, he is just run unsuccessfully for mayor of New York. He somehow escaped prosecution because Norman stabbed his second wife, Adele, during a cocktail party in 1960 and almost killed her. So you have two writers that are dark themselves, and they want to explore the beast within themselves. So how do they do that? They see that women are going missing on Cape Cod. They don't know the carnage that is about to be revealed, but ultimately when the bodies begin to be unearthed, Dan, that's when these two writers understand there's a serial killer out there. And who is it? Now, one of the things with this case, which I again found fascinating, is the killer, Tony Costa. You okay there? Okay, sorry. He doesn't shy away from the investigation. I worked with, when you write a book like this, and you did the same thing, and you rely on the people that were there in the room when these murders were happening, that people that were finding the bodies. So I became connected to a former state trooper named Tom Gunnery. Tom Gunnery was the lead investigator, or one of them, on this case, and he was the guy that ultimately saved women because he put this killer behind bars. But he told me Tony Costa was very braggadocious, not of the fact that he was a killer, but the fact that he thought he could outsmart police. Because these women had gone missing, but their bodies hadn't been found. And he's prime suspect number one. And there's a cat and mouse game that is played over 4 states for several weeks until the truth is revealed in this case.
That interested me on how he left his victims.
Okay.
Because there are several ways. A killer he could just dump them, he could
Yep.
just leave them by the side of the road, or he could, like Tony did, dig a small grave and put them in. But he placed 2 of them, did he not?
Well, that's,
One
yeah.
grave. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's all interesting
Yeah.
in a morbid kind of way. He dug these shallow graves in frozen earth. When the 2 last victims go missing, it's January 1969. Coincidentally, I was born that very week down the street in Cape Cod Hospital. These connections that I have to the case are, there. But so he, again, tries to clean up his crimes, buries these bodies in shallow graves, and when the investigators, again, the first body that is unearthed in the woods of Truro, they believe it's an elderly woman because the body is so decomposed. Now, the first mention of this case in the Boston Globe isn't splashed on the front page. It's actually on page 27. It just goes to show you that people really didn't care about these sensational crimes back then, especially someplace as far away, at least according to the Boston Globe, as Cape Cod. And Cape Codders had there were 2 ways that they thought about the case. obviously, Cape Cod's a seasonal resort area. They want to keep the tourists coming, so they don't want to talk about a serial killer in their midst. Then you have others who are picnicking at the crime scene and gathering up sand around the death pits and selling bags of sand in plastic bags on Route 6A. So you have people that are trying to exploit the murders and people that are trying to keep it kind of low key. And that's where Kurt Vonnegut kind of puts back on his cub reporter hat. He was a police reporter in Chicago when he first started, so he begins to pull the threads of what's kind of happening in and around Provincetown. Now, the name Helltown, Ann, comes from, I didn't make it up, it's a nickname that Provincetown has had for centuries, because Provincetown was once a pirate enclave. So it was, an area where pirates, rogues, and renegades, lived. And somebody mentioned the area as being Helltown because of all the helling that goes on there. So I think the ghosts of Helltown still permeate that town today, and I think the locals, take some pride in that. Provincetown is unlike any other place you'll ever visit, and I say that with great affection for the area and the people there.
Yep. I want to get back to your wondering whether this is his first murder, because he really plans it. He gets away with it for how long? Months, right?
Right.
And so it had to have been started, the thoughts of it, or fantasy, whatever you want to call it, way back.
So way
did he
back.
practice? Usually we found in
Yeah.
serial killers where they did some practice work before they actually committed it.
Well, I mentioned the fact that he was a taxidermist, amateur taxidermist.
Right.
So when he was 16 years old, living in Somerville, he wasn't originally from Provincetown, neighborhood pets go missing. So
There you
if
go.
Fluffy went out and didn't come back, sorry, he was probably stuffed, dissected, and under Tony Costa's bed.
Right.
But Tony Costa ultimately gets arrested as a teenager for sexually assaulting and tying up a 16-year-old girl. And instead of sending him to juvenile detention, his mother, makes a deal with the judge and sends him down to Provincetown, where again these dark fantasies are building within this serial killer. So to your point, Ann, Sidney Monson, who was the first woman that goes missing in Provincetown, I do think he killed prior to that, because Tony Costa also traveled. We know that he was in San Francisco in or about the same time that Charles Manson was there. So you have two people, I don't know if there was any cross-pollination there, but they were swimming in the same circles. They were, meeting the same people in that city at that time. It's interesting to me that both were, again, evolving as killers. And the reason why nobody really remembers the Tony Costa case, it was big news when it happened, obviously. It's because several months later, Charles Manson starts committing murders in LA, and they're famous people. These victims are celebrities. And that takes the Costa story off the front page. And he's a bit jealous of that, because he's a narcissist, Costa, and wants the adulation. Now, when you do your research, Ann, like me, you're poring over thousands of documents pertaining to these cases, right?
Right.
And ultimately they lead you to where you need to go. So with the Costa case, literally, I think 2,500 documents, and those include police reports, witness testimony, trial transcripts, and then we ultimately land on the crime scene photos and the autopsy photos. And that's what made this story real to me. And, as a journalist, you become desensitized to some things that you read. But then, I had grown to, I was so fond of these young women and got to really know who they were. And then just to see how he dispatched and mutilated their bodies, those images haunt me to this day. My wife had to pull me out of the project for a couple of weeks because I was in a bad place. And I'm glad that I was able to take a breath and then go back and finish it, because I thought it was a very important story to tell, for sure. I'm sure you feel the same way about the cases that you've been involved in.
Absolutely, yeah. And I appreciate your talking about the victims. They are so often just forgotten, so thank
Well,
you for that.
well, it's, you know, as I said, it goes back to my 19-year-old
Sure,
daughter.
sure.
You know, my mother was 17 when our 19-year-old sister was taken from her. You know, and I've got a background in, you know, forensic science. When I worked on the Boston Strangler case and re-examined it, I elicited the assistance of Dr. Henry Lee, Dr. Michael Bodden, and we had a forensic re-examination of the Strangler case. So we had to exhume my aunt's remains for DNA testing. And we had to exhume Albert DeSalvo's remains for DNA testing. I've held Albert DeSalvo's skull in my hands. That's how close you get to these stories. And I thought, you know, Helltown kind of, as I said, brought me back to, you know, that era in my own life. And it's interesting, you know, you also learn that, as I mentioned, Tony Costa had supporters back in 1969, supporters that were intimidating police and witnesses. He still has those supporters today. So I had an event at a little bookshop called East End Books on Commercial Street, scheduled for early August. That event has been canceled because the bookshop owner was intimidated and harassed by an online mob of carrying their virtual pitchforks and torches, and they are still trying to protect the memory of a monster. You know, these requests to cancel the event, they weren't coming from Sidney Monsen's family or Susan Perry's family. They were coming from the killer's family and his friends. So again, why would you protect the legacy of one of the darkest killers in American history? But, you know, Provincetown's a unique place for sure. And I feel bad for the bookstore. He's just trying to, you know, make a living, and he should be allowed to do that. And, you know, going back to the Strangler case again, there was a movie produced here locally starring Keira Knightley called The Boston Strangler. It's going to come out either later this year or early next year. Now, you know, I could have reached out to the producer and begged them or demanded that they don't shoot the film in Massachusetts. I'm not going to do that because I have a right to see it or not see it. You know, and other people have that right too. So I want to allow, and I'll see it. You know, and I'll probably keep those thoughts to myself, but I don't want to ever, you know, extinguish somebody's creative passion for a project. And anytime you can elevate the conversation and talk about that case again, talk about the Tony Costa case again, that's, you know, I think that's important.
Absolutely. You know, there's another thing that was very interesting that kind of parallels what I saw in some of the serial killers that we were studying, and that's the having a kind of a dual personality,
Sure.
Good side, bad side. I think he had a name for it.
He did. Yeah, so Costa, they call it ego splitting.
Yeah.
Costa created an alter ego for himself to kill these women, and he named him Corey Devereaux. Corey Devereaux was actually a Provincetown high school student, and you know, who was, you know, selling pot on campus. And turns out that Tony Costa not only was a serial killer, but he was the biggest drug dealer in town. So he was trying to eliminate his competition, and he blamed these murders to the police on this innocent kid. But in his mind, he also swallowed that alter ego and allowed him to come out to create, you know, again, some of the most vicious crimes that you're ever going to see. So, you know, woven into a story about a serial killer is really a story about psychology, and you know better than anyone, Ann. It's what drives these men and women to commit these crimes. And looking at Tony Costa, I mentioned, you know, the love-hate relationship he had with his mother. She was a single mother. His father died saving somebody's life in World War II. He was a real hero. Tony Costa was 6 months old when the father died. So the mother poured all of her love into that little boy. But then she got lonely, she got remarried, she had a second child, and suddenly Tony had to share that love with others, and he was not willing to do that. Again, which is why he manifested these evil thoughts and ideas and projected them on a number of women.
Did you ever find any early childhood experience that might have kind of set the seed, so to speak, for the fantasy?
I did not find out whether or not Tony had been assaulted or something like that. That, I don't know if that happened, could have happened. But, he did go through several, psycho analytic sessions, and that was never brought up. But you had a lot of different psychiatrists studying him, as he was preparing for trial. And it's one of the wildest trials, not only in New England history, but American history. So when you read that part of the case, some of the things that are discussed, in this genteel courtroom on Cape Cod are absolutely atrocious. People were fainting in the aisles because the material was just so graphic. And, honestly, my publisher, we do focus groups before the book comes out. So we gave people the opportunity to read the book ahead of time. And, some of the comments that I'm getting are, it's too graphic. But I could not, as a journalist, shy away from that and then, glorify the killer. I'm showing the reader what I saw and, what I read in the autopsy reports. You may want to skim over that stuff. I wouldn't read it too late at night. A lot of the people that are picking up the book are young women, which is interesting to me. But I do think, true crime as a genre, and has never been more popular. And I think that a lot of that goes back to the pandemic. We were all shut inside. We're watching Netflix. We're watching the docuseries. We're all playing armchair sleuth, and trying to get into the mind of a criminal because it's, forever, ever fascinating. And, during the pandemic, I'm focused on this case and going back and walking the grid, finding the crime scenes again, where Tony Coster buried and murdered those victims, walking around Provincetown, getting a sense of how he did it, who he saw, what he saw, and trying to, provide those images for you so that, the community is very vibrant and real when you read it.
We didn't have as many that dug graves and buried them that we found, so that I thought was very interesting. But they all were very smart, as you said. They had high IQs. They had to, I think, to be able to carry out what they did for as long as they did.
And I thought Tony Costa was probably, he thought he was too smart, and one of the reasons I wanted to write this book as well was I mentioned State Trooper Gunnery. I'd known him for years, and he used to show up at my uncle's variety store on the Cape, and he would ask my uncle, Jimmy, when are you going to introduce me to your nephew Casey? I've got a great story. It's the Tony Costa case, and I'm like, I'm not ever going to write about it, so let's not have that conversation. But again, when I decided to take this on, he was incredibly valuable, and he wanted this story told. And he said, Costa thought he was smart, but they had to track down. You'll see and follow the investigators as they find the bodies, as they find the murder weapons. One of the lead investigators, his name was Bernie Flynn, another state police investigator, and he and Tom Gunnery were the ones that dug the victims up. And they were the ones that discovered two victims buried in the same hole. And that day, they went out here to Boston and arrested Tony Costa living at his brother's house on Beacon Street and paraded him in front of the cameras, brought him back down to the Cape for arraignment the next day. And as Bernie Flynn is coming home, his wife Jacqueline, who I was able to interview because Bernie had passed on, she's waiting for him in the threshold of their home. And she reaches out to him and he pushes her away. And he says, "Don't hug me. I smell like death." So those images stay with, these investigators and the ripple effects of these crimes. It's not, just the victim's family, although that is really, the kind of the ground zero in these cases, but all of the different people that these cases touch over time. And anybody that reads this book is certainly going to learn about something that they may never have even known about. And the journey that you take with the two writers, again, the focus groups are pretty interesting because I'll get comments, God, I love the story about the serial killer, but who are these writers he keeps talking about? I'm like, well, if you don't know who Kurt Vonnegut is or Naylor, maybe the book isn't for you. But learn about them. They're great. They're great writers, and part of it, as I said, elevating the genre of true crime. I just didn't want to write a book that was a straight path toward mayhem and destruction. I want to educate and get people to learn, and it helps me because as a journalist and as a writer, I know what it's like to get pulled into these cases, and not only my aunt's case, but a lot of the other cases that I've worked on as well.
Did that little dog really find the purse of the? I thought that I didn't know whether that was just a nice little.
No, that was that actually happened. Yeah,
It's the dog that finds them after they're looking.
Yeah, and the dog, and it was a complete mistake. This was a bloodhound that didn't have a nose for anything.
Yeah, right.
Stumbled over the crime scene material. So there are moments of levity in the book as well because I think you need it. One of the reasons why I thought Naylor and Vonnegut also were important to telling the story because sometimes I want the reader to breathe a little bit because the material is powerful, it is grisly, it is sad, it is tragic. So, I promise you when you read it, everything ties up in the end. Have a little patience with it, give it some time. Those are the books that I like to read, so I wanted to, entertain myself as well while I wrote it. I can say that I've also been very fortunate to have my books adapted for the screen. So, The Finest Hours I wrote in 2016 about the greatest small boat rescue in American history was adapted into a major Disney film starring Chris Pine and Casey Affleck. It's now currently on Disney Plus. Chris Pine is as handsome as you could imagine.
How about
And
this book? Is this gonna?
well, get into that. Yeah. So, Patriots Day as well. I wrote the book Boston Strong that was adapted into the film with Mark Wahlberg. So Helltown is also in the works as a limited series. Now, when you write a book, you have to first write a treatment for what the book is going to be. Even after 14 books, that's still the process. And the treatment for Helltown was 70 pages because I really got deeply involved in the writing. So I sent the treatment to my agent in New York. I sent the treatment to my manager in Hollywood, and within 3 days, I got the Hollywood deal. And you're going on Zoom calls with some of the biggest production companies in Hollywood, and then the last day, I think I decided who I wanted to partner up with, but I had a Zoom call scheduled with Robert Downey Jr.'s production company, and I got on a call with them, and they were amazing. And they said, we like to work with cool people and interesting people, and if you partner with us, we're going to tell a great story. So we have been working on the limited series for about a year. Every page that I write, I was sending it to the screenwriter as well. So we've just landed our lead actor. I can't tell you who it is, but I think it's going to be, you're going to be very happy with the selection. And this isn't the lead actor to play the serial killer. This is someone who's going to play Kurt Vonnegut for us. The serial killer, I think we want an unknown, somebody that you can just lose yourself with and not think, oh, that's an actor playing this person. If you recall the mini-series, that's what they used to call them on television, called Helter Skelter back in the 1970s. One of the most terrifying, Stephen Railsback, thank you. Stephen Railsback was so convincing as Charlie Manson, probably never got a job again. I'm sure he was up for a lot of, no one's going to hire him to be the sitcom dad for Growing Pains. It's Charlie Manson right there. So, it is a double-edged sword when these actors do take on, these terrifying figures because they can be, branded with that. Part of what I do as well is not only, the written word, but the spoken word. I have a podcast called Saints, Sinners, and Serial Killers, which I host with my longtime writing partner, Dave Wedge. And we sometimes will break down our books to 20, 25-minute podcasts, or we'll write about a case that we had covered. And we got the idea about a year ago to take that podcast to the stage. So we brought our podcast, Saints and Sinners, to the Wilbur Theater in April, and I thought, well, how do other podcasts do this? And I would say, okay, the podcast hosts, they get up on stage and they talk to the audience for an hour. And I said, well, people have already done that. Let's do something a little different. Let's elevate this. So we put a cast together to act out these scenes. One of our cast members is here this evening, very talented actor in her own right. And it just broke the fourth wall. So we had actors playing Whitey Bulger. We had actors playing Albert DeSalvo, and then some of the other cases that we were involved in. The last book that was published prior to Helltown was The Last Days of John Lennon, which we partnered with James Patterson. Patterson, obviously everybody knows James Patterson, but he loved our work and he asked us to pitch him 4 ideas. So we wrote 4 treatments. Some of the book stories, they all were true crime related. Some of them were local or regional, but one story that I really wanted to write was the story about what happened to John Lennon over the last 5 years of his life. Because I'd hosted a pilot for CNN 2 years prior to that, and it was going to be a true crime travel show, kind of similar to what Bourdain did, but instead of food and cuisine, I'm showing you these iconic landmarks where murders occurred, and how the histories of these cities are shaped, by some of these crimes. So when you're going to the Empire State Building, well, you should probably check out the Dakota, where John Lennon was shot, because there's a really rich story and a tragic story ultimately. But during that process, I got the opportunity to interview Paul McCartney, one of the great moments of my life as a writer. Dave and I were the only investigative journalists to get access to Mark David Chapman, who's the Lennon assassin, his case file in Lower Manhattan, and holding the actual arrest warrant written out on December 8th, 1980. It's not a photocopy, it's the actual arrest warrant with his signature on it. It brings these crimes back to you. And I think, I call myself, I'm sure you feel the same way, an archaeologist of words in terms of, really doing the digging, really doing the research. That's what I love. And then imparting that knowledge, to the readers ultimately. With the finest hours, I didn't know anything about, a T2 tanker or the U.S. Coast Guard until I decided to take on that mission, and I had to learn really quickly. And I think a lot of it comes back to my background as a journalist and digging through information, understanding it, absorbing it, and then writing it in the best way you can. And I'm sure you feel the same way.
Yeah, I had a little different experience, but it certainly was to some degree similar to going through material over and over and over and digging that and finding the kernel that you really wanted to develop. I think that's the most important. I found the most important.
Well, I think you're right, because I think it's it can be monotonous and tedious, the work, but you're looking for something that somebody else overlooked.
Yep. And
you have to just go back at it and back at it. You don't review it once, you review it 150 times. The same piece of paper. Because a word's going to jump out that you didn't see and that nobody else saw. And when we did the Lennon book, I learned that John Lennon, people wondered why he became a recluse in the Dakota for the last 5 years before he came back for his comeback album Double Fantasy in 1980. Was he a Howard Hughes figure that just reverted away from the public? No, he had been targeted by a terrorist group in New York City, a Puerto Rican terrorist group called FALN. And they had gotten into the Dakota. They were writing him threatening letters saying that they were going to kidnap Sean Lennon, their young son at the time, and Yoko. And after several letters, they said, no, now we're going to kill you unless you give us this money. Finally, they give up because John wouldn't play ball, and they said, okay, well, instead of your money, we're going to take your life. So when you're out at a cafe or walking through Central Park, we're going to blow you up, and we're going to blow up everybody around you. So John had to, go back within himself and within the Dakota for 5 long years to protect not only his family, but the public. Nobody really knew that story. And that was the kernel we pulled out and decided to, put an exclamation point on it, if you will.
So, your message in your Helltown
Mm-hmm.
for the series that's going to come out. Have you worked on that?
The message?
Yeah.
Well, I think ultimately I want to pay tribute to the women. And the message here is always be aware. The most unassuming person can be the darkest person in the room. And you just don't know. So, how do you prepare yourself for that, right? It's just always understanding your surroundings. And back in 1969, too, which I thought was fascinating, when these women disappear, nobody cared. This Provincetown was a transient community anyways. You had the hippie movement where people were just taking off and joining caravans and traveling the country. And, some of the families thought, well, we may see Susan in 6 months, who knows? As opposed to going right to the police and saying, my daughter is missing. When the 2 women, Pat Walsh and Mary Ann Wysocki, go missing in January 1969, their families immediately notified police. And the police at first didn't really take it seriously until these investigators got involved. So there's a bit of sadness there. And one of the things I wanted to explore as well was the, kind of the misogyny of the era. That still happens today. I mentioned that 1969, we're in 2002. We're coming out of COVID. We're coming out, away from an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Darkness is permeating light. And I think that's exactly what happened, in 1969 and, ushered in Watergate and all of the to come in the early 1970s and the murder and crime and serial killers. That kind of started Manson and his story. And, it leads to Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Albert DeSalvo obviously predated that and was, really looked at more of almost like a romantic figure. The Boston Strangler was a film that came out in 1968 starring Tony Curtis and Henry Fonda. And it's, it's almost glamorizing, the deaths of these women, which as a family you're watching that. And I watched it several years later, which is what piqued my interest in the case. Growing up in an Irish Catholic household, things like that. But I saw the film on cable television one night, and I asked my mother the next month, tell me about Mary. And she said, Mary just wasn't a statistic. She just wasn't my sister, she was my best friend. And they really planned to live their lives along parallel lines, and all of that was stolen from my mother. So I know how these families feel and, try to address these cases and these tragedies decades later. People say, well, do you have closure? There's no closure. There's never closure. You're always missing that person that was so important, to your family and to your loved ones. And, that's why I feel like, the women that you read about in Helltown, I want you to really, remember them. Remember them in your prayers, remember them in your thoughts.
Did they ever bring in a profile, or was that too early?
Too early.
Too early.
Yeah, but again, this was studying him once he was captured. And these were psychiatrists that studied him first at Bridgewater State Hospital and later at Walpole, and tried to really dig in. What they learned was, well, he was also a struggling writer, like Norman Mailer and Kurt Vonnegut. In fact, the killer had written an unpublished manuscript that he would title Resurrection. Now, I got access to that manuscript for the writing of Helltown. So when I take you into these crime scenes, I'm taking you in through the eyes of Tony Costa. Everything that you read, everything that you hear, was first out of his, mind and onto the page, along with 15 hours of audio taped interviews that I also found. So, it's an incredibly authentic book, but it also has themes that date back to In Cold Blood, Truman Capote. Using some fictional threads as connective tissue, and kind of painting scenarios more so in the writers' lives than really in Tony Costa's. But as I said, when you read Helltown, I think it's a thrilling ride, terrifying as hell, but a good authentic story as well. You want to open it up to some questions?
Sure.
All right. Yes.
Did he keep any trophies like some serial killers do?
He discarded as much of the evidence as he could because he thought it would lead back to him. So he was burying not only the bodies but burying evidence as well in the surrounding areas. But to your point, yeah, I mean, I think early on in his career as a taxidermist and, dissecting these pets, I'm sure he kept a menagerie of taxidermy subjects in his house or in his room.
Didn't he take some of the hearts?
Yeah. Let's leave it to you'll see how what he does. He didn't take them.
Or,
Yeah.
Read the book.
Yeah, read the Ann.
Allison, I have a
Allison, I'm
question
sorry.
for both of you.
Go ahead.
Do you have a team, each of you, that researches, like when you said you have to go over things over and over and over again, do you do it yourself, or do you have a team, and how can I join? I mean, how do you?
Oh, I can answer for me. I do all the research. I don't trust anybody else to do it because they're not going to see what I see. Now, when I partner with a co-author like Dave Wedge, I trust him. I'll give him some research to take a look at as he will trust me. But I'm not going to bring on a research assistant to look over files that I need to see myself. That being said, Alison, I'm sure, there's a way to, support the effort because it is, there is a big adrenaline rush when you're finding, the holy grail of these cases and looking at them for the first time. When I wrote the book with Dave Wedge, Hunting Whitey Bulger, well, we found 70 letters that Bulger wrote in his own hand while he was in prison. So for the first time, as we write the book, when he's arrested, he's describing it to the reader because he put this in a letter himself. So again, trying to uncover new pieces of information that nobody's ever seen before. Back to the Boston Strangler case, even after my book was written in the early 2000s, I found letters that Albert DeSalvo, the alleged Boston Strangler, had written to a family in Braintree, Massachusetts. And these were probably 50 letters that he wrote. And inside those letters, he was sharing information that he was going to recant his confession and blow the lid off this case. And within 24 hours after that letter was delivered to that family in Braintree, DeSalvo was murdered in his prison cell. So the Boston Strangler case, for example, there wasn't just one killer. There were several killers committing murders under the guise of this Jack the Ripper type character resurrected to stalk the women of Boston. That didn't happen. In fact, the first murder was committed Gainsborough Street, 77 Gainsborough, and that woman was murdered by a family member. Wasn't murdered by a phantom killer. Yes.
Is there a common theme among the victims? Did he know that no one would be looking for them, or was it more about this wrong place?
I think a little both. That's a great question, though. I do think when you see their photographs in the book, you see similarities in terms of how they looked. As you know, Ann, often serial killers will target a specific style of victim. And again, going back to the Boston Strangler case, that didn't happen. You had young women, older women, black and white. There was no common denominator. But when you do meet Marianne Wysocki, Pat Walsh, and Sidney Monson and Susan Perry, you're going to see similarities in their looks. And I think he targeted a specific type of person that probably reminded him of Mommy.
Yeah, we found that with some of the serial killers is there usually would be someone in their prior history that reminded them, good or bad. I remember one of ours was, he was sentenced to he did a juvenile crime, a rape as a juvenile, and the woman judge sentenced him to a juvenile facility, and he was very angry at that, and that was really the basis for a lot of his murders, because nobody could tell him what he was to do, and especially a woman.
It's crazy.
It is.
You know,
Go ahead.
Ann wrote
Oh,
a
sure.
book about the Green River Killer.
Mhm.
She named, because most of them were, as they say, sex workers.
Yeah.
And she named each, like you gave them a name, like you do in your book, told their story. Each one, I don't know how many people he killed, but I just thought that was just a wonderful thing, wonderful tribute.
Yeah, and I mean, Ann, great writer, and certainly, she supported me early in my career, and read the Strangler book and gave me a nice word for that. But, even though that, most of the victims were sex workers, they were women, they were struggling. Many were single moms, put into this position. You go all the way back, there's a great book on the Jack the Ripper case that focuses on the women themselves, and you realize, the desperation that led them to that point in their lives. And again, that's, their only crime was the fact that, they didn't have people that really truly cared about them. So it makes it even, more sad, doesn't it?
But then you read about there's a guy, he was a mafia hitman, but he wasn't in the mafia, and he was in prison, and someone was fascinated by him and did a documentary.
Was it the gas pipe?
He was the one, he put people in the,
Yeah.
he's the one who sprayed, what did he do? He drove by someone and sprayed substance in their face to see if they would die, and it was just a random person, and I can't think of his name.
No, I think I remember his nickname, but I know you're talking about.
Yeah.
Again, I've written a lot about organized crime and some, how these guys work. A book I wrote called Animal was about the first person ever placed in the witness protection program in the United States. His name was Joe the Animal Barboza, and he was a gangster here. Grew up in New Bedford, and ultimately, became the tip of the spear in the bloodiest gang war in American history, where 57 gangsters were killed in a 2.5-year period. Now that death toll doesn't happen in Al Capone, Chicago. It doesn't happen in Nicky Scarfo's Philadelphia. It happened in Boston, and this Portuguese hitman was the guy doing most of the killing. But he was also incredibly, he had a lot of respect for women. He could kill a guy and not even look twice about it. But if there was anybody that ever, raised their voice to a lady in his presence, they were going to pay for it.
Weren't a lot of them married and they...
Yeah, living there, going to Little League games, and then, garroting somebody at night. But we're also working on, that's going to be a film that we're working on as well, because the gangster in this case, Joe the Animal Barboza, he was kept on an island right off the coast of Boston called Thatcher Island. It's actually close to Gloucester, while Raymond Patriarca, the boss of Boston's in New England, was trying to kill him, because Barboza was the first gangster to ever testify in a criminal trial against the mob in the United States. There was another gangster named Joe Valachi, but he testified to Congress and never testified in a trial. This guy put a lot of bad people behind bars. And he also put some innocent people behind bars too. If anybody remembers the Joe Salvati case, basically Joe Barboza fingered 4 men for a gang murder they didn't commit, because he committed it. And the FBI knew it, but the FBI wanted these guys behind bars. And many of them spent 30 years behind bars. Many of them died behind bars. It resulted in the biggest settlement in the U.S. Justice Department history. for these families. $200 million was paid out to the families of those men who rotted in prison because of Joe Barbosa's lies.
Thatcher Island.
Thatcher Island, which is now, I mean, it's, you can
Yeah.
explore Thatcher Island, and which you know you have to do as a writer. You have to really put yourself there. You know, you can't write from afar. You have to go to these places and smell it and feel it, and you know, try to recall or think about what it might have looked like when these crimes were being committed, when these criminals were, you know,
Oh my
walking the streets.
You know, I don't know, this is crazy.
Yeah.
Because they don't tell you those things.
Well, yeah, I think that, you know, it's that's my job. You know, I'm glad they didn't tell you those things, because, you know, I wouldn't do what I'm doing today. You know, really. But again, you know, when you're a reporter working on a case, you're also probably reporting on 5 other stories, and you have to dedicate only so much time, you know, to these stories, and then you have to move on. Well, I've got the benefit of hindsight. You know, years of, you know, passed between these crimes. The only book I wrote in real time was Boston Strong, which became Patriots Day, and that was an incredible, you know, journey in its own right. You know, meeting and sitting down with these people, these heroes, you know, that lost part of themselves or lost loved ones. I remember sitting down with the family of Sean Collier, the MIT police officer, and we sat down for an afternoon and had coffee and donuts at their house on the North Shore. And I asked all the, you know, his brothers and sisters, it's a blended family, you know, because they'd been interviewed 1,000 times. Oh, Sean was a great police officer. Sean was this. I said, I don't care about that. Just tell me about him. What kind of music did he like? Oh, you know, well, he was into heavy metal, but then he, you know, was a big country fan. And was he a pain in the ass little brother? Because I'm a little brother, and I was a pain in the ass to my big brother. So, you know, that's how you learn about these folks. And all of a sudden, I just sat back and I just watched all the stories go back and forth between his family members. And I was leaving, Sean's mother gave me a hug and said, thank you, because we haven't had a chance to share these stories since his death. We've just been grieving and going about our daily lives, but this was an opportunity to do that. So that's, you know, I think one of the skills I have as an interviewer is just don't say too much. Let them talk, you know.
I have the name, the Iceman.
The Iceman, yes. Gaspipe was a different guy, the
That was
Iceman,
the
yeah.
only book that I could not sleep.
Until this one.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
And then we'll be able to go back to Provincetown.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Any other questions, guys?
I just happened to wander in here, and then it piques my interest because I'm familiar with this Tony Costa. I mean, not personally, but I know the story. What interested you about writing about him?
Well, you know, it happened in my backyard. I grew up on Cape Cod, and again, I wasn't really interested in it until I did a little deep dive during the pandemic, because I just took a trip to P-Town, and the entire town was a ghost town at that time. All the stores were closed. My brother and I are just shooting the shit, you know, talking about things that had happened in Provincetown, and we landed on Tony Costa. I'm like, well, I'll take a look at it, and I was absolutely aghast at the crimes themselves and what he did to these women, and how he was quickly forgotten, and should be, you know, as I said, he should be remembered for the crimes he committed just because it's a cautionary tale, but the women should be remembered more importantly.
That's a question I had. And I haven't really been able to form it exactly, but some of it feels, and I don't mean this about you, I think maybe our general interest in true crime is it feels a little exploitive, or it's a little bit like looking at a car crash from
Sure.
afar. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on the psychology of that. Like, why during a pandemic do you think that true crime may have increased in interest? Like, what do you think that is?
Well, I do think there's, you know, and you can use that word exploitation a little bit. I think there's, you know, there's fascination in serial killers. There's you know, there's so many true crime podcasts out there, and somebody was telling me about their favorite true crime podcast. I haven't listened to it, but they did say to me, well, you know, it's hosted by two women, and they just laugh, you know, through the whole thing. I'm like, laugh?
Yeah, it's all stories told.
You know, there's nothing funny about this.
No.
You know, and I think when I write and when I share these stories, there's a lot of emotional weight behind it. You know, I'm not writing to exploit it. I'm writing to explain it. I'm writing to honor, you know, the people that lost their lives through this, to get justice, to find the truth. Those are my goals. You know, and I wouldn't take on a story that I thought was just a quick rip just to write, you know, just to exploit that case. Which is why I expanded the landscape of Helltown a little bit to bring in some other factors.
Yeah, that was actually what was most interesting to me, bringing in the writers themselves and contextualizing it in history. I think that was
And again, it just showcases the darkness in everybody. You know, I mean, people are always struggling with that. We see that now more than ever. I mean, it's in our face. Every night there's a you know, new tragedy that we have to deal with and brace for, which is a sad statement on society as a whole. And I will say that I think there's something about this country that really heightens that. And I travel the world, and I don't get that anywhere else. You know, but I think there's, you know, something about our culture that breeds it a little bit, I guess.
What is the name of your podcast again? I'm so sorry.
It's called Saints, Sinners, and Serial Killers. Yes.
So I want to know, are there any other cases that you're really interested in that you think maybe in the future you might write about? And then a suggestion, I
Mhm.
think the Long Island serial killer case is a total mess and it's still unsolved and could maybe benefit from this type of.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that's certainly an interesting story. I'm working on a new book project right now about Hollywood in 1958. It's the cross-section between gangsterism and old Hollywood glamour. The mob controlled much of Hollywood, but they were the biggest celebrities in town, right up there with all the actors and actresses that we remember. And, you know, both sides collide with each other at Lana Turner's home in Beverly Hills when her gangster boyfriend is left to die on her white carpet, allegedly shot by Lana's 14-year-old daughter. And that's how it was presented to the press at the time. She was never charged with the case. Johnny Stompanato, the gangster, was killed. Now, what I've learned, and I think the story behind the story is, you know, Lana probably pulled that trigger. But you look at it, okay, well, why would you write about that? Well, to me, look at it through the lens of Me Too. You know, she may be a pioneer in that movement. You know, leading up to his murder, he had threatened her. He had threatened to kill her. He had threatened to kill her child. Threatened to kill her mother. You know, sometimes, you know, those threats are going to become real, and you know the bullet's going to turn on you. So, you know, what I'm researching right now, really, I have a lot of respect for Lana Turner and what she may have done to protect herself and her family in 1958, and that's probably the story I'm going to write. There's another story that I've been working on for several years, and it dates back to 1717, and this is a pirate story. So if you've ever heard of the Witta Pirate Museum on Cape Cod, well, the Witta was the world's first authenticated pirate wreck, discovered in 1984 by an explorer named Barry Clifford and his first mate, who happened to be John F. Kennedy Jr. And this pirate ship went down in 1717 off the coast of Wellfleet. And imagine it was the Titanic of its time. It was a massive Spanish galley called the Witta. And it had well over $300 million worth of gold and silver in that wreck. So far, Barry Clifford has recovered $120 million worth of gold and silver in that wreck. He's got a great museum on Cape Cod. If you haven't seen it, visit there. It's incredibly authentic and it's wonderful. So a few years ago, Barry and I have known each other for quite some time, and he reached out to me. He goes, Casey, I know the work you did with your forensic scientists on the Strangler case, he goes, not only are we bringing up artifacts and gold and silver, but I think we just found human remains in the pirate wreck. So we had to look at what these bones looked like after 3 years. Were they, was it livestock? No, the bones were too big. It was a human femur bone that we were really focused on. Well, could that bone have belonged to the pirate himself, named Black Sam Bellamy? They called him Black Sam because he never wore a powdered wig. And Black Sam Bellamy was the richest pirate that ever sailed. He was more successful than Blackbeard and Captain Morgan than anybody. Within a 7 to 8 month period, he seized over 50 ships. Ultimately, he was coming back to reunite with his love on Cape Cod because they were going to create the first so-called pirate commune up in Maine, and it's interesting, you laugh about that, I did too, but Barry really taught me what pirates were like in the 1700s. They were experimenting in democracy hundreds of years before we were doing it. These pirates were runaway slaves. They were Mesquite Indians. Every pirate on board the Witta had an equal share, an equal responsibility, and an equal say in terms of what the pirate crew did on a day-to-day basis. The only time Black Sam Bellamy was able to overrule them was at times of battle. So we get this bone, we test it at a lab at the University of New Haven in Connecticut at the Henry Lee School for Criminal Justice, and we find a DNA profile. After 300 some odd years, it was amazing. Then the question is, well, who does it belong to? We didn't have Black Sam Bellamy's DNA, so I had to travel to England and track down his bloodline descendant in a little town called Hiddesley, England, which is where Black Sam Bellamy was born in the late 1600s. His mother is actually buried in an unmarked grave in back of the church that we visited because she died during childbirth. So I found the bloodline descendant, I got his DNA, and ultimately it wasn't a match for the femur bone that we found, but since then we've recovered 6 skeletons in the wreck. Yeah.
Who pays for that testing?
Well,
I always hear in podcasts that
Yeah.
cost is a barrier, retesting kind of old cases and whatnot.
have you guys watched the Netflix documentary, The Staircase?
Yes.
Yes.
The Netflix, not the
Right.
HBO.
Yeah.
Well, there's a forensic scientist. There were 2 in that documentary. Henry Lee, which everybody realizes, Tim Palmbeck. So Tim Palmbeck is sitting there with, our suspect and his attorney in many scenes. Tim is my guy that runs the University of New Haven, and I called him and he said, so it allows them to, kind of testing. We did find that a pirate who was born in North Africa, that he was a runaway slave on board that pirate ship. We might eventually be able to find out who that person was because there are so many DNA profiles now in 23andMe. These databases are huge, and they help do kind of the work that we're doing. So we're still in the process of that. I would love to, write and tell that story after the Lana Turner project, because I just think it's really unique and, again, turning the head on the misnomer that these pirates were villains. They really weren't. The villains were in government and enslaved, not the pirates. Yeah.
Do you know about the female pirates?
Oh, yeah. Ann Bonny. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Crazy stories.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you can go back into history and make it real again, and
Wow.
feeling and touching this history and wondering, lucky or cursed, I don't know what it is. Yeah.
What do you do? You seem to, be drawn to these very dark subjects. What do you do? I'm just imagining there's a heaviness to it as a writer because you have to become so involved and write and
Sure.
you're imagining, right? So how do you balance that? How do you go about life and find joy and and I was presume in your work too, if you're really
Why don't you
focused
answer
on
that, Ann?
Yeah, I'm just really curious about that.
Well, I teach, so that I use all of the material I have to teach my students. And the reason I think that there's a lot of interest in it, and especially by women, is you're learning about these situations, so hopefully you don't get into the situation. So, or what victims, I always talk about surviving victims, so that people can think about what you might do if you're in a tight situation. So I from a very positive standpoint, that's how I manage it, and I write, and I'm an academic, I have to write. I don't like to write.
I love to write.
I know you do, I know you do, you do it very well.
And I would say, oftentimes I have to take a break from that material. I also wrote the Ice Bucket Challenge, Pete Frady's life story. So, there's true crime that I write, but there are also, if I can find an inspiring story to write about, The Finest Hour is one of the most inspiring stories that I could ever be involved in. I love to, be involved with those types of projects too. And I need to find some type of humanity even in these true crime stories, which is interesting. For me, it was with Hunting Whitey. Yeah, you're writing about Whitey Bulger, but our viewpoint into his story is a little different. We wrote about, well, how does an aging gangster stay on the run for so long while his body's breaking down? And the FBI, they obviously were partnered with him in the 70s and 80s, but imagine you start work at a company that had something very bad in its past, but they've kind of cleaned up their act. And somebody comes to you at a cocktail party and says, geez, you work there? I hear that place is horrible. You're like, no, the place is great. We've done so much to, correct the past. And that's what a lot of these agents that ultimately captured Whitey Bulger felt. There was one female agent, Noreen Gleason, and she's really kind of the hero of the book because she came in and turned this case on its head. She said, well, you FBI agents in Boston, you've been looking for the wrong person. You've been looking for an aging white guy with a Red Sox cap. You can walk down Boylston Street and find 5 of those right now. We shouldn't be looking at him. We got to find her. And that was Catherine Gregg, the girlfriend. We find her, we'll find him, and that's what she did. So that's heroism for me. And we also, going into these kind of dark areas and getting exclusive access with Whitey Bulger, we're the only ones that actually interviewed his killer. So his killer is a gangster named Gius. And Freddie Gius is his first name, sorry, Freddie Gius. Freddie is in solitary confinement at a place called Misery Mountain, which is